Hey everybody. In a recent video, I talked about the book American Nations, A History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America by Colin Woodard. This is a book from 2012. And Tim posted the following. It's been a while since I last read that book, but I found it to be one of the most interesting I've read in the past 10 years. As you get into the book, I'd like to hear more of your comments on Yankeedom and the left coast, which Woodard describes as a combination of Yankeedom and Greater Appalachia. In particular, how both mindsets sowed the seeds of what we see today. All right, so I'm going to just kind of riff on the book and the thoughts that have occurred to me as I've been listening. Now, I mentioned that the genesis of all of this was that it was a cold day here in Arkansas. And Arkansas is supposed to be the South. And I just went outside without any plan, started shooting a video in the cold, saying, hey, isn't this supposed to be the South? And then it occurred to me that, Arkansas, at least Northwest Arkansas, doesn't really feel like the South. At the time I said it feels more like the Midwest. But now that I've struck upon Colin Woodard's, his framework here, the Midwest isn't really a thing. So he divides the United States and Canada into 11 regions, which are basically 9 founding civilizations on this continent and how they spread out and interacted with one another. And then later came 2 more, which were outgrowths of the original 9. And, my last name is O'Connor. I'm interested in, my Irish ancestry. And I know that, my father's side of the family is from Ireland and my mother's side of the family is from Ireland. In fact, I did the Ancestry DNA test and, here's my ethnicity. I'm from these islands. So according to Colin Woodard's map, Arkansas is divided diagonally in 2. The southeast corner is the Old South, for sure. Flat, plantation land, agricultural land. The northwest, this is the Ozarks. This is mountainous or at least hilly. I mean, if you're from Colorado, you probably wouldn't even accept that there's a single mountain in all of Arkansas or southern Missouri. And for a very long time, it was very sparsely populated, particularly, during the Civil War. A lot of battles were fought right here, but, the people of Northwest Arkansas weren't really part of that southern plantation slave culture. People here did own slaves, but in very small numbers. This was just not a big place for plantations. And, the people here, a lot of them were refugees from elsewhere. And in fact, the Appalachian culture described in the book is a culture of people who came not all from Ireland, but, from northern England and parts of Scotland, basically the borderlands of England, the frontiers of England, where times were, where things were rough. The people who lived there were exploited brutally by their British overlords, and to the point where, they just couldn't afford to live anymore, and they fled. As soon as there was a new world to flee to, they started fleeing to here, North America. And they came in many waves, with crop failures and wars and various catastrophes and calamities sent people fleeing from the borderlands of England, which included Northern Ireland and Scotland. And they came here in great numbers, but these are people who had been abused and oppressed and at war for 800 years and had been effectively living under, anarchy. They were an abused people. And, if you abuse a people and then you give them some power, they don't tend to use it responsibly. They don't tend to be good people. But when I got into the book, that's what I was interested in, was this book. And before I start talking about the book, let me just say, I went to coffee yesterday with a guy who grew up here in Berryville, in fact, just across the road. And he graduated, from Berryville High School. He went to the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, which is where my parents went to school and where they met. And as we were walking to the coffee shop, I just brought this, this whole topic up to him. I said, is this the South? And he, without ever having heard of Colin Woodard's book, said the exact same thing. The southeast of the state is the South, the Northwest, no. And I asked my mother about this. I asked the neighbor about this. I asked this guy. He grew up here. He now lives in Montana, but he's back here, unfortunately, for a family funeral. But everybody mentions the same thing. When you ask, if Northwest Arkansas is part of the South, they say, no, it's, hillbillies here, and everybody mentions moonshine. Like, my mother just, when I asked her if this was the South, and she said, no, not really. And she came up with this phrase from her childhood, that they pipe in the sunshine and pipe out the moonshine. People around here made a lot of moonshine, which comes up in Woodard's book. But rolling back a little bit, I was interested in the Appalachian culture. That's what I really wanted to get into. And he has a chapter for each of these 9 founding nations, and Appalachia comes last. And I was determined not to skip ahead. So he starts with really, no offense, folks, but the culture I was least interested in, which is El Norte. This is the Spanish part of the country. Coming up from Mexico, the settlement patterns starting in the American Southwest and moving north and into California. The Spanish were charged by the Pope with Christianizing the savages here, not here, but in the American Southwest. And they put down on paper a very noble sounding plan for creating these missions where they would bring in, natives, Indians, to Christianize them. And these, recruits were called acolytes. And the idea was that you would train up the acolytes to run the missions themselves, and then the founding priests would then go elsewhere and start a new mission and repeat the process. That was how it was on paper. Not only were you supposed to be Christianizing the savages, but also setting up an economy and putting them in positions of power. But, as it worked out, the priests basically just enslaved the Indians and, abused them horribly, appropriated their labor, never turned over authority to them, and, without actually buying and selling them as slaves, used them as slave labor. It was nasty. Another culture, an early culture, is one that started in the Northeast, and this was the French culture. Now, the French were unique in that when they came to this continent, they saw the native people as, people who should be allied with. And so the French, and mostly French peasants, who came here, often intermarried with the Indians. They cooperated with the Indians. They formed allyship with the Indians. And so there was a tight bond between the French and the Indians in what is now Eastern Canada and Northeast United States. Unfortunately, later the British would fight a war, with the French and win, and all of the French territories were ceded to the English. It didn't mean people there started speaking English, and the Quebecois still speak French to this day. But, that whole paradigm of partnering with the Indians kind of went by the wayside after the French-Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, as it's called globally. As I'm reading about these different groups, it's just natural to look for good guys and bad guys. And my people, the Borderlanders, the Appalachian folks from the borderlands of the British Empire, definitely not the good guys. Definitely not the good guys. But for the most part, there are no good guys. If there are any, they are the French. And maybe the Dutch. The Dutch were brutal in Africa. But the colony of New Amsterdam, later named New York, once the British took control of it, again by military force, they were all about commerce. They were all about trade. They didn't care about imposing any religious or political ideology on anybody, and they didn't care, what ideology people subscribed to, as long as you had money in your pocket and you were there to do business. That is the culture of New York. New York City, Long Island, New Jersey. That's just, it's been that way. It's that way today. It's been that way forever. But they were pretty amoral when it came to slavery. They had no objection to it. You could buy and sell slaves on Wall Street. So it goes. The Yankees. Now, I've just moved here to Arkansas from Vermont. When I was in Vermont, I worked for the TV station. I would shoot video at the select board meetings and the board of trustees meetings, which happened every other week. So every Tuesday there was a meeting in the basement of the Bellows Falls Opera House movie theater / town hall. And, on alternate Tuesdays, it was the select board, and other Tuesdays, it was the board of trustees. And then once a year, there's a big village meeting. That all started with the original colonists who moved, and set up shop there. These were religious fanatics. And, there's a piece by William S. Burroughs called Thanksgiving Prayer. And it is this ironic, sarcastic, thanksgiving for all of these aspects of America. And you can point to different parts of this Thanksgiving prayer and say, oh, that's from this founding nation, that's from that founding nation. There's a part where he says, thanks for a country where nobody's allowed to mind his own business. Thanks for a nation of thinks. That comes from Yankeedom. That comes from the New England settlers. In Yankee New England, there was no concept of minding your own business. Their belief system was that humanity is flawed but perfectible. And perfectible, means you can make institutions that bring society to a more godly state. And central to that is that the individuals have to sacrifice their own autonomy and their own ability to make choices for themselves, particularly moral choices. That needs to be subservient to the community. Now, to this day, this is the crazy thing about it. These founding institutions and lifestyles persist for centuries, because I just came from there, and to this day, there is civic participation like I've never seen anywhere else. People participate in local politics and governance to a degree that is just unknown, particularly in this part of the country. But, anywhere. Like, I moved there from New York City, and in New York City, there's so many people and so few people, there's so many residents and so few people in government compared to the number of residents that there is no possibility whatsoever, that you're even going to get your local alderman on the phone. Whereas in Vermont, I could get the lieutenant governor on the phone. I could easily get my state representative on the phone, and my representative in the Senate, or in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., Peter Welch, I had regular dealings with his office, and they always responded to any email I sent to them. I got a detailed response. That's Yankeedom. But Colin Woodard in the book brings up the example of a ship captain. His name is Thomas Kemble, and in 1653, he lived in New England. He left on a 3-year voyage, gone for 3 years. He came back. His wife, whom he hadn't seen in 3 years, met him at the door of their home, and he kissed her. What's more, it was Sunday. So the local government, somebody saw him, reported him to the local government. The local government, the local government pronounced him guilty of lewd and unseemly behavior, and he spent 2 hours in the stocks for kissing his wife at the doorstep of their home after 3 years apart. Thanks for a nation of thinks. That busybody in your business, up in your grill, calling the police for the most minor infraction to enforce ideological compliance, that's Yankeedom. Thanks, Yankees. But, they're really organized. Another founding nation is the Tidewater Nation. I'll keep this very brief. Basically, the Tidewater Nation was supposed to just be England again, like, rural, manorial England, with the younger sons of the English gentry getting to set up shop and, live as if they were the firstborn and inherited the whole manor. So they wanted to live, that lifestyle, but there were no serfs. That lifestyle depended on serfs who were bound to your land and who absolutely had to, work your manor and provide you with free labor. There were no serfs. So that region was largely populated by indentured servants. Later, after the Old South came along and showed everybody the value of just chattel slavery, well, then the Tidelanders switched from indentured servants who were awful. They were treated awfully. They were treated almost like slaves, but there was a period of indenture, and if you played your cards right and you lived through that period, you could be a free, though probably poor, person in Tidewater. Then, almost the exact opposite. William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, he was a Quaker, and the Quakers believed that people are essentially good. This is very different from the New Englander Yankee belief that people can be made good. The Quakers thought people are good. This is the nation that Colin Woodard calls the Midlands. The Pennsylvania Quakers, they thought people were good, and they invited and welcomed everybody. And a lot of the people who went there were Germans. And sometimes whole German towns would relocate to Pennsylvania. So to this day, you have the Pennsylvania Dutch. You have large Amish communities there, large Mennonite communities. And, my friend Kevin, he lives in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I used to visit him regularly. Lancaster, Pennsylvania is just really prosperous, neat, organized, buttoned down. There's lots of Amish there. It's very German. So Pennsylvania and the Midlands was a welcoming place, and they didn't impose any particular Christian religion. The idea was that anybody could come and practice whatever Christian religion they want to in Pennsylvania. Great. The problem was the Quakers were pacifist. They were nonviolent. They were also, they like to martyr themselves. They like to piss off other Christian sects so that the other Christian sects punish them, harass them, torture them, kill them, and they got high on the martyrdom. But absolutely nonviolent. Problem was, they lived in a violent world. There were violent assaults by Indians, by raiders, by French soldiers. There's just lots of call to defend your home territory, and the Quakers wouldn't do it. So they were very prosperous, largely because of that German influence and the fact that they were very welcoming to everybody. They were great at business. They were absolutely shitty at self-defense and at civic governance. And so William Penn brought in a variety of governors who were not Quakers to try to set things right. And it just didn't happen. Now, here's why I'm spending time on the Midlands and the Quakers. When the Irish and the Scots-Irish came here to North America, a lot of them ended up in the Midlands. And because they had been, they were borderland people. These people are basically Klingons. They have been fighting. They do not respect anybody's authority. They're definitely an honor culture. An honor culture means you are willing to do violence at the drop of a hat if somebody insults your honor. There's a cartoonist who I absolutely love. Long dead. He's from the 18th. He's from the 19th and 20th century, that turn of the century. His name's Winsor McCay, best known for Little Nemo in Slumberland. And his name is spelled M-C-K-A-Y, but when his family came to North America, they were M-C-C-A-Y. But Winsor McCay's grandfather changed it to K because so many times people came up to him and said, "Oh, you're a McKay? Come with me. We're going to go fight the McDougalls." I just made up McDougalls. I don't know who they wanted to fight. But, they always wanted to be fighting. So the grandfather changed the spelling of the name to say, "Oh, I'm not one of those McKays. I'm McKay with a K. You go find your own kid and go do your fighting." But that, that cycle of violence, which is honor-driven, tit for tat, eye for an eye, restitution for past violence with new violence, that is very well known in American culture as the feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys. Two Appalachian borderland families, clans, just, visiting revenge attacks on each other for generations. That's the culture. So when the borderlanders, the Scots-Irish, the Scots, the Irish, they would show up in the Midlands, they themselves wanted to get out to the frontier as quickly as possible. They did not trust authority. They did not want to be bossed around. They wanted to get out, away from the population centers and live out there in the wilderness. And nobody, as I say, nobody but the French really was nice to the Indians. Sometimes there was, from necessity, there were cordial interactions with the Indians, but it was really just the French who allied with them. The borderland folk, the Klingons, sometimes married the Indians, sometimes, joined the Indians and just adopted the Native American lifestyle. They went native, but they were just as likely to do battle with the natives and kill them. There were many peaceful native tribes, and the Klingons came and killed them. There was one incident where the Klingons, killed a bunch of Native Americans, and then some of the ones who got away, they fled into Philadelphia, and the Klingons raised an army to go and lay siege to Philadelphia because they wanted to go to the jail and kill the rest of the Indians who had fled there and were in the jail for their own safety, in protective custody. Benjamin Franklin came in and negotiated a ceasefire and diffused that situation. But, my people, were ready to do violence. And they absolutely would not tolerate any outsider coming and imposing anything on them. Anything. So they went to the frontiers. Sometimes they joined the Indians. Sometimes they killed the Indians. But they were just ungovernable. They were unruly. And they absolutely were, they insisted on their individual autonomy and rights. And, that is part of the American character now. And this is where it comes from. It's from this nation, my people, the Klingons, who came here and got out away from the city centers, went off into the hollers and into the mountains and into the woods. And they had this tendency to, because they had lived in constant warfare back in the British Isles for hundreds of years, it had been impressed upon them at the genetic level almost that there's no point in building up a nice, prosperous farm because some battle's going to rage through there and destroy it, or somebody's going to come and kick you off that land, or somebody's going to say that they own that land and you have to pay them for it, and they're just going to raise your lease, raise the taxes and the duties that you owe to them, even though they live like on a different island. So they just learned there's no point in building up wealth. So they had a preference for preserving their own freedom over building wealth. And they were notoriously lazy. They didn't like arable agriculture. They had their garden plots and they liked to hunt, but they didn't really like to farm. Farming was not their jam. What was their jam, if they had some corn to spare, was whiskey. And it wasn't just for drinking. Whiskey basically was the currency. It was a portable, storable form of wealth that you could take with you, that had a long shelf life, that was always welcome and always, in demand. So the drunkenness and the propensity to always be moonshining, definitely. I mean, it's not an unfair stereotype. It is an accurate description of how my people like to live their lives. So they started like in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and then they pushed west and south. So, the Midlands runs from east to west, down below the Great Lakes and then up again. And the Appalachian culture sort of tilted down, stayed below the Midlands through Illinois, down through Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and into Texas. Texas is very far from the Appalachian Mountains, but that settlement pattern, which started in the Midlands, around Pennsylvania, in and around Pennsylvania, pushed all the way down into Texas and even into New Mexico a little bit. It is that culture, that nation extends along this east-west band, curving down to the southwest. And northwest Arkansas is part of it. And, I haven't spent much time in southeast Arkansas, but I have driven on I-40, from western Arkansas to eastern Arkansas, across the Mississippi, over into Tennessee. And when you get, out east of Little Rock, it is a very, very different place. It's just different. The landscape is different. The people are different. Their accents are different. Everything is different. It is a different nation, but it's within the state of Arkansas. So is Arkansas the South? Well, yeah, the southeast portion of it is. The northwest portion, we are the borderland Klingon, ungovernable, ornery, prone to violence, will not take shit from anybody, Scots-Irish, Northern English. Don't fuck with us. And, that, I haven't gotten to the part of the book yet where the author talks about the far west and what he calls the left coast. These are the two nations which were built by the original nations, the original 9. I haven't gotten that far yet, but I've heard him talk about them. And yeah, the Yankees showed up on the left coast by ship. They got on a ship on the east coast of the U.S. and they went south, down around South America and back up and, stepped out onto the left coast. Whereas the Appalachians traveled overland to get there. And two very different, modes of transport, two very different mentalities, which then coalesced in California to create, this. There's in Silicon Valley, there's a very, there's a strong libertarian trend. And libertarianism, the don't mess with me, I got mine, I'm managing my own affairs, you keep to yourself, you keep off, keep out, keep away from my stuff, and don't tell me what to do. That mentality is very strong in Silicon Valley. There is a strong libertarian current in the tech culture, but there is also that nobody's allowed to mind their own business aspect that comes from Yankeedom, that comes from New England, comes from always looking at everybody else to make sure they're behaving the way you think they should. And we certainly see that, in how the tech culture and the tech companies enforce wokeism on people who have no interest in it. But again, I haven't reached that part of the book, so what I said just there is entirely, just out of my head and based on just a few things I've heard the author say in interviews. And also on the very influential and well-known paper, I don't remember the author's name, but I think it's called The Californian Ideology, and it speaks to this as well. All right, I've rambled long enough. If you've made it here to the end, you must really like the sound of my voice or something. But if you did make it this far, please do hit that like button. And a great thing to do. I mean, if you're interested in this, if you have any feedback, post your comment. But I would really appreciate it if you'd post a link to this video somewhere. Twitter, Facebook, wherever. All right, I'll talk to you later.